What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button, and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to it.
In principle, to buy a car radio or even a tape recorder from common folk families such as Bylina, Star, or Grodno in the USSR was not a special problem. This equipment was present on the shelves of stores, and the deficit, if there was, it was not too acute. However, most motorists bitterly realized that the Soviet car audio was 10 years behind the foreign versions in terms of technology and functions. They were low-powered models in terms of sound, often monophonic, poorly holding the frequency of analog tuning and motion, crackling from interference generated by ignition, chewing cassettes. They were often made by military or near-military enterprises that did not pay much attention to the quality of civilian products. Nevertheless, under the very sunset of the USSR, one of our leading enterprises, tightly and for a long time engaged in car audio equipment, as they would say at the time, gave birth to an elephant. Staropolsky radio plant, despite the agonizing industry in particular and the country as a whole, made a powerful leap of the dying lion and brought to serial production impressive for its time in terms of functionality and technology model car stereo Ural-292. This tape recorder is a completely unique artifact of the Soviet industry in its car accessories segment. It was 100% and without any irony in the trend of all technological achievements used by foreign manufacturers of that time. It had practically no software compromises, as it may seem to the generation of Zoomers. Even its design was quite on the level, no frills, but typical for imported analogs, convenient and not at all outdated for its years. The Soviet industry had not produced anything similar in terms of functionality either before or after it. Of course, it is impossible to say that the model was released on time nose-to-nose with its foreign competitors. The lag still took place abroad, exactly the same in functionality, and design. Tape recorders became mass market earlier, but not significantly, just a few years before the appearance of Ural-292. And these few years were not something crucial. The technology in those years was not evolving as fast as in the era of smartphones. Ural-292 functions: radio receiver with digital tuning, 6-station memory, automatic and manual search, illuminated LCD display, cassette player with auto reverse, 2x12W output, power tone and balance adjustment, crazy 1300 rubles. Ural-292, a machine with a curious history, and it still does not give many rest. It is used to create media garbage, dozens of bloggers parasitizing on the topic of cars in general and the USSR in particular. Actually, your humble servant also parasitizes on this topic with pleasure and on a regular basis, but only specifically, only having real and physical objects of research at hand, and not just collecting copied scraps on the internet and making compilations from them, sometimes heavily embellished with his own speculations. On the fertile history of Ural-292 was not marked only rare car blogger, and everyone necessarily mentioned that the cost of this car stereo in 1991 crazy 1300 rubles. And everyone considered it necessary to cite as evidence advertising an informational note from the magazine Radio in 1991. And usually it was a scan with a pencil inscription of the letter carrier 1927, which was circulated on the internet. This advertisement does indeed include a price of 1300 rubles for an Ural-292 complete with 2 cabinet speakers. Some grief bloggers even tried to convert this money into today's rubles, voicing sums of about 70 to 80,000. Everything would be fine, but nothing can be learned from these fabrications except sofa lyrics. No one has been able to clearly explain the reason for such a high cost. And also no one asked the question, who and how managed to buy these expensive devices in the crazy and poor post-Soviet years? Wheels, as usual, unearthed all the details and nuances. So here we go. Every blogger of the Zoom generation, writing about the price of Ural-292, preliminarily Googled something like his salaries in the USSR in 1991 and found out that in Moscow, if we take the maximum, doctors' teachers received about 150 to 170 rubles a month, an assembler on the assembly line of AZLK, about 350 to 400. After that he called the price of 1,300 rubles for a car stereo, an item clearly not a necessity, shocking. But the point is that such wages were at the beginning of the year, and the advertising module from the magazine Radio is dated November 1991. And by that month, too many different economic failures had occurred in the country, not to mention political ones. The USSR approached 1991 with a total shortage of almost all consumer goods, which was also accompanied by serious shocks. The year began with the infamous monetary reform, later called Pavlovian, which aimed to reduce the amount of money supply in the country that was not secured by goods, in other words, to utilize part of the population's money. Then, in April 91, the first retail price reform took place. It was not yet a complete free float, but a 1.5 to 2 times increase for a lot of things. Salaries and scholarships, it is important to note, were also raised, but they, as usual, did not keep up with the store prices. And in October the course for the so-called liberalization of prices was officially adopted, after which they began to grow at an unthinkable rate without any control from the state. Plus, a sales tax was introduced, which had not existed before. Hyperinflation developed. If those who refer to the advertisement in the November issue of Radio magazine had bothered to leaf through the whole issue of the same magazines for a year and observe the dynamics of price changes in the advertising blocks, they would have seen, for example, in the same October issue of a Radio, an advertisement of a book by a certain G. N. Lyovkin, Introduction to IBM PC, XT-PC Circuitry, 428 rubles 25 kopecks plus 1 ruble 41 kopecks sales tax, aha, the same one. And in the December issue, the book IBM PC, XT, AT, PS PC Repair for 950 rubles. Or Hey Smart Modem 2400 for 5,500 rubles. It was the rapid and nonlinear economic storm of 91 that partly explains such a price for Ural-292. Why only partly? Because the wide and previously unseen by Soviet motorists functionality and numerous advantages from the consumer point of view were provided by extremely high constructive complexity, and the assembly of the tape recorder was carried out almost entirely manually. This model really had a very significant production cost, which the USSR, which had entered the peak, could not partially compensate. The state enterprise, so that the production would eventually reach the store shelves with more or less reasonable price for citizens, as it was done in the Soviet Union before. And what's inside? So, apart from geopolitical and economic reasons explaining the high price of Ural-292, there were also purely technological reasons. We found them under the lid of the tape recorder case. But before we look inside, let's look first into a Japanese car stereo of approximately the same era as a kind of introductory for understanding. If we remove the mechanics of cassette pulling from an imported tape recorder, we will see something like this. A monoboard made by automatic assembly, with perfect repeatability, with no tuning elements that require manual adjustment by human instrumentation. Specialized chips to control the cassette drive, specialized chips in the tuner, 4-channel amplifier in a single chip package with minimal dodging on the edge of the board, since the side of the case acts as a heat sink. After assembly, the board is immediately ready for installation in the case without manual tweaking and adjustments, the perfect embodiment of manufacturability and serialization. And now let's open the same Ural-292 for comparison, having also removed the tape drawing mechanism from it. The electronics of Ural looks like some experimental scientific device from the arsenal of Doc Emmett Brown. Several boards are mounted on a central motherboard, including 2 separate radio modules for FM and AM in huge shielded blocks. Several boards are connected to the motherboard by stubs but stand alone, lots of connecting wires. The clutter of architecture is daunting for an appliance at this level, which had to be inexpensive. In order to implement digital control of the radio receiver, LCD display and frequency memory, Ural used a huge industrial microchip controller, which was completely irrational for such tasks. The firmware was written not automatically at the chip manufacturer, as in the case of a specialized chip for digital FM receiver, but manually for each controller at the factory assembler of tape recorders. In order to realize 2 channels of sound with only 12 watts each, and this is not in average, but in peak, as many as 4 separate amplifier chips are used, switched on each channel in pairs. Many circuits in the radio path were tuned manually by instruments, the master on each copy of the tape recorder turned coil cores, and rotors of tuning capacitors and resistors with a dielectric screwdriver, guided by instruments connected alternately to dozens of control points. The tape recorder was controlled by a huge 40-pin chip installed on a separate mini-board, an 8-bit microcontroller, or microcomputer. As they used to say in those years, of 8051 family with 4 kilobytes of memory, developed by Intel in 1980 as a universal controller for various industrial systems. By the way, with quite industrial characteristics, it worked at temperatures from 40 to plus 85 degrees Celsius. Ural-292 was indeed a very expensive design in production, in view of the attempt to assemble on a huge number of universal Soviet radio components. What abroad was done on a few highly specialized ones. In addition, it became even more expensive in retail sale due to the difficult economic situation in the USSR on the eve of its collapse. We have found the answer to the first question. Why did the 292s still survive to this day? Due to practically artisanal small-scale production with a huge share of manual labor of assemblers who sat without wages, as well as total impoverishment of the population in the early 90s, the tape recorder Ural-292 was clearly not on the first place in the wish list of most Soviet citizens. And one could assume that nowadays it is almost unreal to meet it in person. However, even today, on the secondary market in 2022, it is not particularly exotic. Yes, in general we can say that it is a rarity, but, if I may say so, the rarity is not too rare. On online flea markets, the legendary car stereo pops up on average in Russia every 2 to 3 months for ridiculous money, which allows restorers of authentic Soviet cars, collectors and just fans of USSR style to wait a bit and eventually get what they want. Given the supposedly negligible print runs and the more than 3 decades that have passed since the year of the model's announcement, this may seem odd. How such a complex and expensive tape recorder managed to produce any noticeable circulation, and who managed to sell it. Nevertheless, we managed to clarify this phenomenon. Within the framework of a small retro research, we managed to find not only one of the first copies of Ural-292 of the early 90-foot S, but also a much later one, 1999. And, despite the external identity, inside we found interesting differences that answered many questions. The thing is that the factory managed to preserve and significantly increase the production of this model thanks to the transition to the above-mentioned foreign standard of architecture and assembly. Late modifications of the tape recorder in many respects, though still not completely, got rid of the original non-technology with the use of discrete Soviet microcircuits and transistors, a huge number of manual operations during assembly and fine-tuning individually for each copy. The clutter of electronic boards, heaps of tuning elements, confusion of wires, huge radio modules and shielded coffins and amplifier on a whole heap of discrete parts disappeared. Instead of them there appeared quite technological-looking main and only board, where specialized microcircuits of Toshiba and Philips. Instead of a whole handful of Soviet universal microcircuits and transistors became responsible for radio reception, work with weak audio signals and power amplification. That is, in fact, the whole secret. After the beginning of the application of technologies peculiar to large-scale factory production, rather than a pilot workshop, the tape recorder ceased to be a one-off homemade and became quite technological, conveyorized and mass-produced, well, still with correction for the Russian realities of 1999, of course. That allowed it to go to the people, even if not in too large numbers, but obviously more than the initial, practically low volume assembly on the knees in 1991 allowed. Today Ural-292 is an infrequent example of a bright spot in the gloomy sky of the USSR automobile heritage, and the acquisition of this tape recorder in decent or even new condition is a good luck for fans of domestic young-timers and collectors of Soviet household items. In conclusion, the Ural-292 stands out not only as a remarkable piece of Soviet engineering but also as a symbol of the era's ambition in automotive audio technology. With its intricate design and advanced features for its time, it justified its high price tag, appealing to those who sought quality and innovation. Understanding the Ural-292 allows us to appreciate the blend of functionality and artistry that defined Soviet car culture. As we reflect on this unique stereo, we gain insight into the broader narrative of technological progress and consumer desires during a fascinating period in history. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Ural-292.